What up, everybody? Now, one of the major issues that has come up in this election campaign is, of course, the issue of free trade. Both Bernie Sanders in the Democratic Party and Donald Trump in the Republican Party have made political hay out of this issue. Actually, it might be more accurate to say that Donald Trump is making hay out of it, since he's actually the Republican frontrunner, whereas Bernie Sanders is struggling a lot more to gain traction against Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primaries. But no matter. Obviously, this is probably the most pressing and contentious issue in this election campaign at present. So I thought it would make sense for me to give my general take on the issue of free trade. Now, you all know that I'm a libertarian, albeit a pretty heterodox one, which is to say I'm not very dogmatic. I'm willing to break with libertarian orthodoxy to an extent on a number of issues. But this is an issue where my views are pretty conventionally libertarian. I do believe, as a matter of principle, that people should be able to do business with pretty much whoever they want in any part of the world without governments, in other words, politicians and bureaucrats, getting in their way and erecting artificial barriers between human beings simply because they happen to live on opposite sides of arbitrary lines in the sand drawn by other politicians and bureaucrats and soldiers in various conflicts and negotiations past. So there is that economic liberty rationale for my support for free trade at bottom. But I do think it's important as well to look at the empirical evidence surrounding free trade and look at the real-world consequences of that policy. It's not enough just to judge it in terms of abstract philosophical principles and premises. We should also look at the concrete impact that it has on flesh and blood human beings' lives in the real world. It seems, and this is something economists, particularly those who support free trade, will tell you, yes, it does produce certain losers as well as winners, particularly in the short term. What people need to keep in mind is that although some jobs will be lost, again, at least in the short term, as a result of greater international economic competition, there's always going to be some of that happening in any dynamic free market economy to one degree or another. As new technologies replace or at least supplement old ones, you'll see jobs in companies that produced older products being lost. But they're also typically being replaced by jobs created by firms that are active with new technologies and that are introducing those new technologies to the marketplace. I don't think anyone would suggest that we should have prevented the invention of automobiles simply because they put horse and buggy makers out of business and all of the poor workers who had skill sets that were peculiar to the horse and buggy industry lost their jobs as a result. I think most people would agree that the economy and society as a whole ended up better off as a result of that innovation. That's just one example. Now, we've heard a lot about job losses in this election, and what we keep on hearing from people like Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders is that free trade has resulted in the shipping of American jobs overseas. Now, there are a few points I wanted to observe that I've seen pointed out by people who are definitely much more expert on economic issues than I am. Just a few observations, empirical facts that I gleaned from a few different sources, including a Washington Post article that I linked to underneath this video. For one thing, you've heard a lot of criticism of free trade with China. Now, economists have concluded in recent years that China's entry into the global economy has had a massive impact and that it has cost a number of American manufacturing jobs, but apparently, that impact has been declining somewhat in recent years. Now, China's breakneck development has finally begun to slow. Apparently, China's relatively low wages have actually begun to rise in recent years, which has made it a somewhat less appealing place to outsource jobs. And as a matter of fact, apparently some manufacturing jobs are already beginning to be brought back to the United States. For example, in 2012, General Electric brought almost 4,000 jobs back to the US from China and Mexico. So it seems that although, the entry of a massive country like China into the world economy was bound to have a major disruptive impact on the world economy and on the economies of wealthier countries, but it seems that that impact is beginning to level off and the economy as a whole, the global economy, is beginning to adjust to it. In addition to that, let's not forget China's entry into the global economy has lifted, from what I've read, millions of people out of abject poverty in that country and in a number of other countries that have also benefited from commerce with China. So that needs to be taken into account as well. What's more, apparently, a lot of the manufacturing jobs in Rust Belt states, places like Michigan and Ohio, have been lost not to foreign countries, but to other parts of the United States. Places like Georgia and South Carolina, states with so-called right-to-work laws and more business-friendly climates overall. So that's something that needs to be taken into account as well. In addition to that, a lot of those manufacturing jobs have been lost not to outsourcing of any kind, whether it's intranational or international, but simply to automation. The replacement of a lot of manufacturing jobs, strong back work, with automation, with robots and machines. That is something that can't be blamed on foreign competition. What's more, apparently, we've heard a lot in this election campaign, especially from Donald Trump, about China's artificial manipulation of its currency to keep it artificially cheap, which makes it easier for it to export and harder for other countries to export to China, and so on and so forth. But apparently, China actually has not manipulated its currency in the past 2 years at least. And Japan, which is another country that Donald Trump in particular has condemned for engaging in that kind of currency manipulation, apparently Japan hasn't done it in at least a year, with one exception in the year 2011. Those are all things that need to be taken into account. Also, apparently, as early as 2009, President Obama's own Council of Economic Advisors found that although it's true that real wages in the U.S. economy since the turn of the century have been relatively flat, apparently one of the main reasons for that is actually not foreign competition, but sky-high healthcare and health insurance costs in the United States. Apparently, because healthcare is so expensive in the good old US of A, employers are increasingly having to devote more and more of their resources not to giving their employees raises, but to covering their employees' healthcare costs. Apparently, that is a major thief of what should be a lot of the raises that American workers otherwise would be getting. Again, not really something you can blame on free trade. But I think that in addition to all of that, we need to look at the big picture. And I do mean big, as in the global picture. What a lot of folks have not taken into account in a lot of the discourse that you hear about inequality, income and wealth inequality nowadays, is that on a global level, inequality has actually been declining, not increasing. Now, this is something that I discovered relatively recently as well. I was reading an article on Stratfor.com, also linked beneath this video. It states this, and I quote verbatim, "Between 1820 and 1950, a handful of nations in Europe and North America transitioned from farming to fossil fuel economies, pulling far ahead of the rest of the world. According to economist Branko Milanovic, global income inequality nearly quadrupled during this period to reach a Gini coefficient, which is economists' score that they use to measure income inequality, to reach a Gini score of 0.55. After 1945, as the Industrial Revolution spread to the rest of the world, the global Gini coefficient leveled off and has even dropped since 2000 as Brazil, Russia, India, and China have taken off. The rich are getting richer, but the poor are getting richer faster." That's right, ladies and gentlemen. You hear a lot from people like Bernie Sanders about income inequality, but they're talking about income inequality within wealthy countries like the United States. They're not looking at income inequality on a global level. It seems that the inclusion and introduction of previously impoverished or abjectly impoverished countries such as China and India and Brazil into the global economy has actually lifted so many people out of poverty that it has exerted a downward pressure on the global gap between rich and poor. So, that's really, I think, a fact that we all need to take into account when we talk about free trade deals. Yes, of course, they put some pressure on developed economies, industrialized nations' economies, but I think that we would be making a huge mistake to abandon free trade simply because it causes some substantial short-term pain in countries that have had it so good economically compared to the rest of the world for so long. I think, on balance, it's a good thing that the wealth of the world is being shared more evenly, less unequally than before. Only the main thing that's having that impact is not massive government intervention, but rather free market capitalism and global competition between countries in their economies. Frankly, I think that the economic dislocation that has been suffered by wealthier countries like the United States is worth it in order to lift hundreds of millions of the world's poorest people out of poverty and give them a chance at prosperity as well. I remember when I was young, I used to oppose globalization. I thought that it was unfair, unjust, all the standard condemnations of the capitalist system that you hear from folks on the left, which is where I used to be until about a decade ago. One thing that influenced my change of heart on that subject was the finding that so many of the world's poorest people have been and continue to be lifted out of poverty by the spread of global capitalism and the process of industrialization and economic development. I remember reading a lot of analyses from left-wing sources like the New Internationalist magazine. Even those left-leaning sources condemned barriers to international trade as one of the major sources of economic injustice and exploitation in the world economy. On that score, at least, they were quite right. I could not agree more. Given the impact that the removal of those trade barriers has in giving some of the world's poorest people a fair shot, or a fairer shot at least, at getting their slice of the global economic pie, we in the wealthy world should do what we can to adjust to the dislocations caused by free trade without abandoning it altogether. It's only fair, it's only the right thing to do. Now, there are certain policies that we'll need to implement in order to at least soften the blow of international competition for workers who are displaced by it. I think stepped up job retraining probably needs to be part of the equation. And for some time now, I've been sympathetic to the idea of streamlining the welfare state to consolidate a lot of these different social assistance programs, government assistance programs, into a single program that would provide people with a basic annual income. A much simpler and more straightforward way of helping out people in need. These are all just ideas that, we all need to brainstorm as wealthier, more industrialized societies around the world. I think we should bend our energies to adapting to the new economic order while not trying to upend that entire economic order, upset that apple cart, and take bread out of the mouths of the people in this world who suffer from poverty the most. When it comes to free trade, ladies and gentlemen, the best philosophy, the best policy is mend it. Don't end it.